All
Okay.
right. See us live on Twitch.
Boom. We're in it.
Perfect. And we are
Execute.
live on YouTube. Yay.
Execute episode 66. It's time.
uh that's what I should have named the episode.
Hey, it's not too late for YouTube.
True. Perhaps we should have been more Star Wars themed for
Nah.
this episode.
I mean, I don't know. To be fair, they did kill off a lot of Star Wars in this one, so it's okay that we don't have them because, right? That we did some murder.
There you go.
Okay. Good. Okay. Are we ready?
Ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Welcome to episode 66 of the TCCG Roundtable. We're your hosts, Dragon Rider, Dankestad, and Ron Mexico. How's it going?
Hey,
Going
good to be here as always.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's Friday.
it is. I'm so excited.
Obligatory mention that it's Friday. I had to.
Friday again. That's awesome.
I know. Oh.
Lots of good stuff on Fridays. Get to play some card games. Get to get in gear for the weekend. It's October, spooky month. It's good.
It is October. Oh my gosh. This year has gone fast, I feel like.
They get faster every year.
I know. It's nothing to do with the fact that we're getting older. No.
Yeah, I mean, your frame of reference is getting wider. I mean, hey, my dad is almost your age now. He just turned 60 yesterday. So, I'm sure he thinks they're pretty quick as well.
What's this about the relativity of time? I don't believe it.
Yeah. I mean, if you want things to slow down, just go really fast. Try that.
Wait, is that how it works? Okay.
If you want things to slow down, you could play against the hostage mage in Wild in Hearthstone. That could help. Just make minutes feel like hours,
Play against any deck that Dankus likes playing.
Wow. I'm sorry that the rest of you guys don't find long-term decision-making and resource preservation toward an abstract goal to be an enjoyable experience. Jeez.
Sorry, what'd you say? I passed out partway through.
I said hero power pass.
Ooh, nice. I'm in. I'm listening. Go on.
So that's a hunter strategy. I knew it would get your attention. All right.
We go face.
So what's going on today? What's special on October 4th, episode 66? What do we got?
Well, we got a lot of sets going through their reveals right now, getting ramped up for releasing. There's going to be a lot of stuff releasing either later this month or in November. I think next month in November, there's like, what did we say, 7 different card games, something like that, releasing sets or releasing some sort of product. So yeah, we're kind of just in that getting ready for all of the sets to come out. So lots of reveals happening, lots of creators getting access to things like Pokemon TCG Pocket, which people are playing on Android and iOS from New Zealand or temporarily living in New Zealand, whichever way you look at it. But that's releasing October 30th, so at the end of this month.
Yeah, also on that one too, we've heard there are some little rule differences, some streamlining. I've heard from a little Kiwi from New Zealand that prize cards are no more. The mechanics are a bit different, smaller bench, and it really is optimized for mobile. So I have not made my flight out there yet to Oceania, but I'm excited to get my hands on it soon and try it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if we have much for specific news other
Well,
than like the competitive news for Star Wars.
yeah, I guess before that, we have one more little thing. So, new TCG announced from Bandai. Take new for what you will, but there is the Gundam game coming in February. I'll admit it, I've never engaged with any piece of Gundam media, but I had some Gundam toys as a kid that were rad as hell. So if you like Gundam, they do look sick. So check it out.
I'm pretty sure I saw an episode of Gundam on Toonami in like 2001. Perhaps. Sounds familiar.
Oh, all right. Uh, do you want to read the competitive news, Ron, or would you like me to?
If you could take this one, I don't know what I wouldn't have enough to add on the Star Wars front, and I don't have any updates for Hearthstone just yet.
Okay. Well, I guess for Hearthstone, there is a small Hearthstone tournament happening at DreamHack Atlanta this weekend. So that's our competitive news for Hearthstone. Also, I will say Supergirl Gamer Pro coming up for Battlegrounds next weekend. So that's exciting.
Nice.
And then for Star Wars, we mentioned last week that they had talked about planetary qualifiers, season 0 starting. And then they had announced pricing and prize support, but there was a lot of feedback that was kind of negative, I would say, about the original announcement stuff. So they did listen to feedback and said that they would be posting about some changes once they kind of settled on what they were going to be doing. So they have announced what those kind of changes and additions are. They have sent an additional 64 participation prize cards to all of the stores that are running planetary qualifiers, which is great. So that means there's going to be 128 participation prize cards for each of the stores that are hosting that for, ideally all of the 128 people that they're going to have, which is fantastic. But on top of that, they also sent 6 booster displays as additional pricing. So that's pretty cool. I don't think that was something that many people really expected. It was mostly just about the cards and the amounts that they did already announce. So yeah, they added more on top of that. They did mention that they are going to be kind of reviewing and finding more iconic cards. I'll say, I think that's what they used as their wording, was that the cards that have been chosen as the pricing support is not quite as iconic as what people are looking for. So they will be going to kind of review that and change it going forward. And then the last thing that they mentioned is for this season 0, they already have it set up so that winners of the PQs will automatically get a buy for day 1 of the Galactic Championships and go on to day number 2. But they are setting up a special event that's going to be happening on day 1 of the Galactic Championships for the PQ winners that will include exclusive swag in addition to that day 1 buy. So that's pretty cool. I think that's kind of an exciting thing for people who win, and more of an incentive for people to want to win, I think.
Definitely. And, on the subject of competitive Star Wars, I think we have some AFG news there as well, don't we, Don?
Yeah, we can announce that. I'll be announcing it a little bit more officially on our socials, the Amberflight Gaming socials, later today. But we do have a new AFG member, Markolopoulos, who is focused on Star Wars Unlimited. So he's going to be doing some competitive playing for us and Yeah, we're really excited to have him. He's awesome.
Yeah, and
Sweet.
I'm excited to learn more about the ropes, learn the meta, and hopefully get beat up a little bit with Star Wars because I don't get beat up enough at my local store. So Marco's got to bring the pain.
That's right. John needs it. But yeah, that is our news and competitive stuff. So what do we have for our main topic this week?
We're going to be talking about deck building, the elephant in the room. I think it is, you have players who engage in card games that spend 90% of their time playing and 10% of their time deck building. And then you have sickos like me who spend 10% of their time playing and 90% of their time deck building. And, it is a different set of skills. It's not the only thing that card games test, but I think that it's good for players, even who are in that 90% who just want to play, to know a little bit about deck building, what goes into it, and how they can make adjustments to make their decks feel right for them.
I think 90% is generous, but thank you. I would go 98% playing and 2% deck building, perhaps. And out of that 2%, at least 1.5% is stealing decks from other people who made them.
Yes. And the first thing we should say is there's no shame in that. Do not feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. If someone has done something well, my advice would be to take their deck, look at it a bit, figure out how it works, and play it. You don't have to agree with every decision they made. I have played decks that I dislike. And after playing them, sometimes I realized that I was wrong. The deck was good, and that the person playing the games had figured out something that I couldn't just from looking at it. And sometimes I'm right, where making a small change or optimization could work. So, as long as you are thinking about the deck, trying to learn from it, and seeing what makes it fire, there is absolutely nothing wrong with taking an established good deck and using it to play the game and learn more about the meta.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'd like to kick things off with talking about like the very, very basics of deck building. And that is knowing what the rules are for deck building. Uh, Turns out you need to know how to build a deck for the game that you're playing because each card game is going to have different rules for how to build the deck. So that includes the number of cards in the deck. Some games might be 30 cards for the deck, some games are 50, some are 60. So, and there's even formats like Commander for Magic where you need 100. So, you got to know kind of what you're building for. And then knowing things like how many duplicates are allowed. Can you only have 2 copies of a card? Is it 3 like Star Wars? Is it 4 like Magic? How many? How many cards are you allowed to have of the same name? And do you need to include resource cards in that like Pokemon or Magic? Like the lands or resources there. Do you need a sideboard like for a tournament? That's something that you can, maybe include if you're looking at that, but that's important to know. And what else do we need to know about deck building after you kind of know the basics of what you're looking for? How many cards you need? You need a win condition. That's kind of important. So I would say that's a possible starting place when you're actually building your deck. Like, how am I going to win with this deck?
Yes. And we talk about it a lot, but there are micro plans and macro plans. And figuring out your win condition is part of identifying that macro game plan for your deck. So when you see things, we tend to want to plan for the ideal, but you have to look and think on average in a game, what am I going to be doing on each turn? And how is it advancing me toward this win condition or this goal? And, looking at the micro level, you can look specifically at something like, say, your curve and say, on 1 resource, I'll be playing this card. On 2, I'll be playing this one. On 3, I'd ideally want to have this combination of cards. And doing a little math, you can figure out how often that happens. So It can be a rewarding process. It can also be a daunting one if you aren't super into math, you aren't super familiar with the game or the card pool. And, this is a great spot where taking an established deck can help you out. So, just to backtrack slightly before, I think that all of those topics about knowing the rules are pretty meaty and do prompt some interesting questions. So, the first one for you guys, and this was a new one in my experience when starting universes, was it's probably the only card game I've played where it is sometimes correct to have more cards in your deck than the minimum allowed. So, that in and of itself might be something new for our listeners. So, how do you guys interact with that deck requirement in the games that you play?
What, like,
So, this is crazy, Ron. You don't even know. You're just like,
yeah,
oh,
I mean, like, you're talking non-Hearthstone things, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm like a child lost in the woods.
so yeah.
Everything is scary and unfamiliar.
So yeah. Hearthstone is easy. It's got to be 30, 40 if you are a Renathal enjoyer, but you don't have a choice. You just have to put either 30 or 40 cards in your deck, and it's that simple. But take a game like Magic, where for a standard constructed 60 cards is the minimum, or Yu-Gi-Oh, where it's 40. You can do that, but sometimes you can put in more. And don't why wouldn't you put in more in those games typically?
I think the biggest reason to not put in more is if you're looking for some consistency, looking to draw certain things, looking to find that win condition or find your synergies, uh, find your resources if those are included. You will kind of want to potentially look at how much of the resources you're putting in the deck versus non-resource cards, and that can help you with that consistency as well. But yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest reason to not include more.
Mm, definitely. And being able to get those key cards on time is especially important. And once again, math is your friend here. And you can see what the difference is in a game of Magic of how likely you are to find your good card on time with a 60 card deck versus a 65 card one. And it is much larger than you think. So, would advise you to look into that. For universes, though, it's actually very funny because, coming in with my prior card game experience, I'm like, of course, I want to run the minimum. And not many players run the minimum in universes. And well, sometimes they are not probably doing the optimal thing. One of the best tournament players in the scene famously runs 110 to 130 cards in their deck with a 60 card minimum, and they crush it. They have great results, but hey, he's a great player. He can get away with it. But the a lot of the other decks tend to have between 60 and maybe 67 cards. And this is just because the card velocity in universes is extremely high. In a typical tournament game, you will very often see your own deck or see your whole deck and draw everything. So having that many cards does not stop you from finding your important ones. And the mechanics of the game are very unique. And when you do something like build, like play your resources, you need to have enough of them in your hand to play them. And sometimes there are important cards that you just cannot compromise on cutting, but your ratio for resources will be off. So you need to add cards to your deck so that you can both run this powerful effect as many times as you can and maximize your odds of drawing it without hurting your odds of having the resources you need. So that's a pretty unique problem that I've found so far, but that doesn't mean that it could never come up again or that there are other games where it doesn't exist. So keep an open mind. And when you're new to a game and you see people running more than the minimum, ask around and see why. Sometimes they might just be like, because I like having a lot of cards in my deck and maybe it's just their style, but sometimes there is a really good competitive reason to do so that helps you win. So that one can be a little bit more complex than just play the minimum or play what you have to, don't think about it.
Nice. Yeah, I would say there's like three things that would come to mind for reasons in general in like a vacuum. It's like one would be like if your deck has some kind of dual mill effect, and it's like, okay, well, I mill my opponent's cards and I mill my own, but I have more total cards, so I'm gonna win that battle. And then it's like if you, I don't know, have cards that maybe pull cards from your deck. So you need like, you know, a density of like high powered cards, and you have enough cards that pull those cards. And then outside of that, it's just like, I don't know, mega card draw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for Hearthstone, the only example of this I can think of that was actually really interesting was Renathal Quest Priest. And, obviously a control priest deck loves having extra health. But one thing about it that was kind of underrated is that being able to run 10 extra cards gives you more consistency at those higher mana costs. So in 30 card builds, oftentimes a mutinous eating your card or a Theatar could just stop your quest or make it take substantially longer than it would if you have the redundancy at that point in your curve. And with 30 cards, you can't afford to run it because you can't cut the other cards and make your ratios off. So just having those 9 extra cards of buffer on top of the additional 3 drop help priests get their quest more consistently. And even without the Renathal boost, Quest Priest might still have wanted to run a 40 card deck nonetheless, which is very, very atypical for a deck in Hearthstone.
I heard Quest Priest a bunch of times, blacked out.
The oxygen to the brain just left the body.
No, but you make a good point. It absolutely makes a lot of sense. It's just like you have some uh alternate paths to protect your win con, not necessarily like an alternate win con like we're going to talk about later, but sometimes there's disruption that wrecks your win con, so you have alternate ways to protect against the disruption, which is pretty clever in decks of that nature.
Yeah, so while we're on it, Mr. Hearthstone, why don't you tell us about duplicates? Why on earth would you ever only run one of a card when you could just run as many as you want?
Oh, you just always run one of each card so that you can run Reno. Easy. You always draw perfectly when you run Reno decks. It actually does this funny thing where it fixes the RNG for you so that it's strictly correct to only ever run one of each copy, because you'll have higher consistency, even though it might be counterintuitive. The game's like, no, no, I got you.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's off base, and you want to run duplicates in general because there are certain cards, if you're allowed to run additional copies of them, they happen to be very good, and you want more. And you also, despite just in general maybe wanting more of them, you also want to be more likely to draw them. And if you only have one as opposed to two, you are much less likely to draw that one important card that does that thing that you needed to do at that particular time that you need it to happen.
Yes. And one thing that you can do in deck building that's very cool is if you have a lot of those cards where, sometimes there is an effect that's important in a particular matchup, but not part of your standard game plan, is that instead of running extra copies, you can run cards that find them in your deck and bring them to your hand or bring them into play. So in most games, this is known as tutoring in reference to demonic tutor in Magic the Gathering, which I think is the most famous early example of this sort of effect. But you can find your answer. In Hearthstone terms, you can get your weapon destruction, you can get your silence effect by using cards that let you discover minions in your own deck or spells in your own deck. In Magic, you have cards like Demonic Tutor and other searches. Classic Yu-Gi-Oh had Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest to do this. But it's a good mechanic for consistency. And like if you are able to cut a copy of Acidic Swamp Ooze for a card that could be Swamp Ooze or it could be something better for a little bit of additional mana, that's excellent. And, when you're looking at your deck building, figure out if there is a way that you can get lots of effects and impact lots of matchups in a smaller bundle of cards rather than a larger one of tutors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tutor good.
Yes. And we have so many of those in Hearthstone, right? That's why it's a very, very common. Every card says it, right? Don't you wish?
I mean, there are a lot that do
Instrument tech,
the
you got
tutoring
that.
thing now. Yeah.
Yeah. Instrument.
Certainly a lot different from how it used to be. Like, I mean, card draw was like pulling teeth in years past, and now we have started to hit a critical mass of like some draw this thing type cards in certain decks, at least.
Yeah. So resources can vary. Oh, Don, did you have something you wanted to say about duplicates?
Nope.
Okay, so no duplicate there. All right. So for including resources, this also varies game to game. Magic, people tend to run about 40% of their deck as lands, universes, 66% as foundations. Some games don't really have resources at all or have a really unique system like Lorcana's. And then Pokemon, who knows? I'm going to make Based Ink Twitch somewhere out there. And, some people want to run a third of their deck as energy. And I've seen some competitive decks run four or less. So you can really customize in that game. But do you guys have any, hints or inklings on that make you kind of think about what you want to have your resource ratio as?
Uh,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I would say it depends on the cards that you're running in the deck. Like you want to look at your curve, which is the cost of the cards that you have. If you are running a lot of cards that are really low costed, you don't need as many of the resources, so you can put a lower percentage of those in your deck. If you're running a deck that has a lot of more like medium and high cost cards, you want probably a higher percentage of resources in your deck to make sure that you actually can find those resources to be able to play your cards. Otherwise, uh, you'll end up being in a position that people have aptly and fondly called getting mana screwed. And nobody likes getting mana screwed. So you want to be able to actually play your cards. That's why you put them in the deck. So um, that can vary, I would say. And also the format that you're playing. Like I think if you're doing some sort of like a draft or a sealed event, that might be a little bit different than if you're doing a constructed deck. So knowing kind of what format you're playing in, that can impact how many resource cards you are going to put into your deck.
Yes.
Nice.
And for the games where we don't have resources or have cards as a common one, like Star Wars Unlimited and potentially even Wild Hearts, which not out yet, but one that we've gotten to play a few times. Every card in your deck can be put down as essentially something that you can pay to use your cards. So in those games and games like Hearthstone, your curve is kind of set out for you, but there still is some planning that comes to mana cost. So, Ron, why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so as far as planning for mana cost goes, usually, at least in something like Hearthstone, it typically involves like mapping out what you're doing this turn and next turn, as sort of like the baseline of what helps you prepare and play better within those games. And that means when you're building your deck, you need to try to figure out how that works with, like you mentioned, a curve or just overall like concepts for the density of what you need at certain different mana costs. Because on turn one you'll have one mana, so you might want to have a certain density of one mana cards so that you have a high likelihood of playing a card on turn one, if that happens to be important to your deck and the way that it's going to play. Aggressive decks typically are going to want to play minions early, get on the board, and start hitting your opponent as quickly and as often as possible. And that means a higher density of one mana cards so that you have something to do on turn one. And also, maybe your turn two could be a one and a one or a two. Um, in rare cases, maybe you have a 0 mana card that enables some other things, or a 1 mana card that refreshes you some mana, and you get to do all sorts of other shenanigans. But we don't need to get into like all those complexities here. The basic concept is simply that make sure that you have a way to be flexible in your game plan and how you approach the game, and what that's going to look like on your turns 1 through 5 at a bare minimum, especially for the aggressive decks, and then 1 through 10 plus if you happen to be a more control-y style deck. And those control-y style decks, they're perfectly happy with turn 1 is end turn. I don't I don't do anything on turn 1. If I'm very fortunate, maybe I've drawn my 1 or 2 1 mana cards that does a thing. It's usually like a tutor effect or something, because it's drawing me the more important thing for later. But generally, hey, that's fine. So that's also like I've planned out my turns. My turn 1 is pass. My turn 2 is hero power. My turn 3 now is I do the card draw thing that I have, so that I can do the 2 and 2 or the 3 and 1 thing that I'm going to have for the next turn, while still kind of seeing what your opponent is doing and how you need to game plan for it.
Definitely. And also worth pointing out, just in case you haven't looked at the stat side of it, not you personally, Ron, I know you have. But if you are building a deck and you want to have a 1 cost card on 1, a 2 cost card on 2, and so on, say up to turn 5, you don't want to run an equal number of 1, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. Because if you're going into turn 5, you have 4 more draws to find that card in games where you draw 1 card a turn than you do to find that card that costs 1. So, generally speaking, you're going to want to have some sort of curve of cards in your deck where the turn that's most important, often 2 in Hearthstone, has your highest distribution of a particular cost. And some decks that varies a little bit between numbers 1 and 3, but you usually want to have the most of that number and then a little bit less of each of the next one going to either extreme.
Wait,
So,
hold on. I'm not supposed to go 5 of each cost and then 4 of 6 costs? No wonder I keep starting my games with 4 5 mana cards in my opening hand. I'm like, where are my 1 drops?
hey, that's
Dang.
hey, that's 4 of a kind. You're exceptionally lucky. So, yeah. So, just, like, try different things. There are some decks that, like Ron said, are happy to kind of miss their turn 1 because they have higher impact cards that they want to find on time. Like in classic Hearthstone, Warrior is okay in missing their 1 drop if they're more likely to find Fiery War Axe or Brawl to swing the game back in their favor. Or, Risky Skipper if you want something more modern but still old. Or in the most modern of age, Bellowing Flames. Like, those are the cards that you want to see early, and it's okay not to have a 1 drop if you have more ways to ensure that you find that board clear on time.
Absolutely.
Mm. And last of these topics, sideboard. So we can start Hearthstone here. What's in the ETC?
It's everyone's favorite question. It's Twitch chat's favorite question for sure, ever since the moment that ETC has been introduced. But a very interesting card introduced to Hearthstone, where like they sort of got around the problem of you can never have a sideboard by having a card that has 3 cards in it as choices that you have pre-built into your deck, and essentially just have different options for different game situations. So um, it's more popular for sure in control style decks than any other, because ETC himself is a pretty slow card. He's a 4 mana 4/4. That's not really much of an impact most of the time, and can put you fairly far behind in terms of like a tempo loss. But in terms of what it can do for your overall game plan, especially if you have a very survivability focused deck, it's like, well, here's more board clears for certain situations. Here's a specific win condition card that would be way too slow in some matchups, but is incredible in other matchups, and I don't know what I'm gonna face on ladder. And then your third one is often pretty techy. Sometimes they're all just super techy. And it's just like, okay, well, this one's a weapon destroyer, and this one does a freeze, and this one happens to counter a specific card that my opponent might have. Maybe it's a dirty rat in there, so it can pull a win condition out of their hand, and I can deal with it. That's a pretty common ETC type thing.
What does he mean by techie exactly?
Tech cards are like very specific cards that are made for a specific reason in that deck. So, for example, if you are going to be facing against more aggressive decks that want to play those early minions, maybe you play more removal, or you include cards that have taunt or that have to be targeted first, however that keyword works in whichever game it is that you're playing. And they're just in there for a very specific purpose, and that purpose can vary depending on what the card is and what the matchups are.
Yeah, generally they are garbage if they're not being used to do their specific ability. Like a weapon destroy card is pretty useless if your opponent does not run weapons. So often that would be considered like the tech decision to run the weapon destroyer. And well, if you queue into somebody who doesn't run any weapons, you're like, oh, this card kind of sucks now, huh?
Yeah, so it's very nice to be able to have those cards that are really, really high impact, but in really, really niche situations, be available to you in that sideboard when you need them. You also can kind of go with a transformative concept for your sideboard instead, which takes tech to a pretty far extreme. More feasible in some games than others, but your aggro deck can become a control deck, vice versa. You can even side into or out of a combo if the card pool allows for it. And there also are some sideboard cards that actually do something, even when they're in your sideboard. So look into your game and see if those exist because sometimes you might need one. Like the recent example I can think of is the learn mechanic in the Strixhaven set from Magic the Gathering that lets you just kind of get cards out of your sideboard almost like ETC in Hearthstone. So, there are lots and lots of applications for that. So, be sure to really figure out what that sideboard entails.
Yeah, clever.
Yeah.
One thing that you reminded me of, sort of, it's like you're building to a possible win condition while never actually needing to go for it, is something like ETC having climactic necrotic explosion in a Death Knight, where it's like you might be playing ETC at a point where you never ever take that card, but your entire game plan and the cards that you use over the course of the game and like spending corpses to level up that card to make it stronger, were you to possibly choose it from the ETC, is like an interesting thing. And it might just rot away in the sideboard, never get used, or it might be the thing that wins you the game.
Yeah. And when it's the one band of fistful of corpses instead, well, you have that choice too. So it's nice and a lot less committal to run a 4 mana 4/4 that can find you something useful than to put this 10 mana card in your deck that is just there no matter what and sometimes can cost you games.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think in general too, what you're looking at in terms of like sideboards and tech cards is generally looking at more of like best of 2, best of 3 formats where you're playing multiple games. And that's where you're going to have a sideboard, and not as much when you're just playing best of 1, because you don't have a sideboard that you're going to switch in after game 1. So, because there's only one game. So that's another thing to note too, is that when you're building your deck, if you do have a sideboard, then think about, you want more general stuff for your initial deck, and then you want more of those tech cards in the sideboard to be able to switch into if you need them in games 2 and or 3. So that's kind of where that comes in. Sometimes you can run tech cards in like best of 1 formats. That does happen for sure. but it's again for very specific reasons. So that's going to be more of looking at what is popular in the meta. Are you trying to target something, or are you trying to build a deck that just wants to do its own thing and needs to not have those kind of tech cards and really just needs to build for its own purpose?
Definitely. And, like the general term for that is interaction that we use a lot for card games. And, there are different kinds you can have. So, like the tech card example that Don pointed out is a really good example of kind of reactive interaction where where often your opponent does something and you respond. So they play the weapon, you play the swamp ooze. They play the creature, you play the removal spell. But sometimes you might even side in or have in your main deck a proactive bit of interaction as well. And, like one example of this was in Legends of Runeterra early on in the game's lifespan. The counterspell Deny, while used in control decks, was most popular for aggro decks because you establish your board, you attack, and if your opponent has their neat trick or spell that's going to mess up your attack, you say, nope, gotcha, and you just deny it away. Magic, there are plenty of tricks that give hexproof or stats that let you win a combat. And, knowing you're going into a particular deck can make those react or those more proactive kind of pieces that you're setting up and using with your game plan all the more powerful.
So I think what we're saying overall here is when you're first building your deck, especially if you're more new to deck building, is start more generalized, and then as you get more experience facing off against other decks and more practice with that deck, you can start narrowing things down, changing things a little bit, adding more of those tech type cards. But initially, when you first build a deck, I would say you're not going to be looking at, okay, I want to add in weapon removal in this deck, or I want to add in those tech cards. You're looking at, what do I need to do to win? How do I build a deck that wins? And what does that look like for this deck? Is it playing a bunch of early minions? Is it just removing what my opponent is doing and letting them run out of cards? Because that's also, knowing how I guess the like end of deck scenario works for each game is very different, right? In some games like Hearthstone, you take fatigue damage. For Magic, if your opponent can't draw a card, if their deck is gone, then they just lose. So that's kind of like a win condition that some decks use, usually referred to as mill, I think is the most popular, trying to run your opponent down in their deck number. So start more generalized and more vague, and then you can kind of focus in and change things and uh, add in specific things for very specific matchups and look at sideboards and that kind of stuff as you play the deck, as you get experience with it, and as you face off against other decks in the meta.
And that condition really does vary from game to game. So, Pokemon, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, you have the very familiar you deck, you lose situation. In universes, you just remove 10 cards from play, shuffle up your discard, and keep going. And there are some decks that even want to mill themselves, run out of cards, and get to that game state for some sort of advantage, which is cool. Star Wars, Unlimited, Hearthstone, you're taking damage. And for me, we've brought up flawed TCG before, and that one just nothing happens, which is fascinating. You just continue. If you would draw a card, you don't. That's unfortunate. And the game goes on. I even had a match playing with some friends locally where both my opponent and I agreed to a draw because we ended. I think we got to actually get back on the air, so that might be important.
Oh, right. Good point.
Oh, we're live. Go ahead.
We are live.
Yes.
Sweet. So yeah, going back on the aspect of deck building, just as far as like ways that you can approach it. Sometimes the thing I thought was really cool was you can identify like, hey, I think this card is really cool, so I'm just going
Is during Knights of the Frozen Throne. That deck was a
ah,
classic.
There's some good examples of deck building from Dog also. Thinking back on like the Vegas Masters Tour, like forever ago, the one that he won. Back when it was Specialist, and there was
Mhm.
some really interesting like sideboard stuff with Mage.
Oh, we could have talked about Specialist for sideboard.
True. I actually forgot about Specialist till just now when you
Yeah,
reminded me when you brought up Dog.
yeah, and since we are live again, Chad, if you are still with us and you are a big fan of Specialist, please raise your hand. And I assume there are maybe dozens of you in the world, and if one of you is just be lucky.